The headlines coming out of Tehran and Washington regarding the two-week ceasefire are being processed by the global press as a diplomatic breakthrough. Pundits are debating whether this is a victory for the current administration's pressure campaign or a strategic retreat that emboldens the Iranian regime. This debate is entirely performative. It ignores the structural reality of the conflict. When you view this ceasefire through the lens of power mechanics, it becomes clear that what is occurring is not a de-escalation of hostilities. It is the formalization of a new, more dangerous phase of strategic exhaustion. The mathematics of this conflict is simple. In a theater defined by asymmetric attrition, a ceasefire is not a bridge to peace. It is a necessary logistical pause that allows the adversary to finalize their control over the decisive terrain. To understand the celebration within the Iranian political apparatus, one must abandon the 20th century geopolitical framework. The Iranian leadership is not celebrating because they have won in the conventional sense of military triumph. They are celebrating because they have successfully maneuvered the United States into a structural position where the cost of continuing the war exceeds the value of the geopolitical objectives the war was meant to achieve. This is not a failure of American firepower, it is a failure of American strategic calculus. The internal Iranian perspective, as signaled by their officials and the state-aligned media, is that this ceasefire represents a validation of their core theory of conflict. Endurance is a form of power. By rejecting the earlier, more aggressive proposals and forcing the current administration to accept a two-week window, Tehran has demonstrated that the American ability to dictate the tempo of this war has been compromised. The ceasefire is not a concession. It is a tactical permission slip for Iran to solidify its domestic and regional positioning. When you force a superpower to accept your terms for a pause, you are not negotiating. You are exposing the limits of their deterrence architecture. Let us dissect the geography. The Middle East is a theater of extreme friction. It is not an open plain where air superiority translates into decisive political change. It is a region of dense urban centers, complex logistical choke points, and deeply embedded insurgent networks that function on low-cost, high-volume tactical assets. When the United States deployed its high-end maritime and aerial assets, they were operating on the assumption that the adversary would respond in kind. Iran did not. They utilized the geography, the Zagros Mountains, the subterranean infrastructure, and the maritime bottlenecks to turn the American technological advantage into a strategic burden. The 160 bombs dropped on Lebanon in 10 minutes were a kinetic display of American-aligned power, yet look at the strategic outcome. The infrastructure was degraded, yes, but the command and control capacity of the adversary remained functional. And in the immediate aftermath, the ceasefire was proposed. This is the inversion of the conflict. The power that has the capacity to destroy is now the power that is searching for an exit, while the power that is being destroyed is the one that is searching for a path to long-term consolidation. The tactical victory of a 10-minute barrage is negated by the strategic reality of a ceasefire that leaves the adversary's core capabilities untouched. That is not a victory, that is a performance. We must address the second-order effects on the regional security architecture. The GCC states, the traditional partners of the United States in the Gulf, are looking at this ceasefire with a mixture of dread and pragmatism. They recognize that if the U.S. is willing to pause after such intense kinetic activity, their long-term commitment to the region is not an ironclad guarantee. It is a temporary, volatile variable. This realization triggers a shift in the regional power balance that is almost impossible to reverse. These states are now actively hedging. They are reaching out to Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow. They are building their own redundant security arrangements because they have learned that American foreign policy is currently hostage to the volatility of Washington's internal political cycle. The economic reality is equally unforgiving. The ceasefire is being sold as a way to stabilize the energy markets, but the market is not fooled. The volatility in oil and gas pricing is not a reaction to the war. It is a reaction to the realization that the American system is no longer the sole regulator of global resource flow. Every day the truce holds. The market recognizes that the stability of the Strait of Hormuz is now guaranteed by a fragile consensus between two hostile powers, rather than by the projection of American naval supremacy. The global market is a machine that runs on certainty. When you replace certainty with a two-week truce, you have not fixed the problem. You have only ensured the risk. The internal pressures within the United States that led to this ceasefire, the political polarization, the economic fragility, and the unsustainable debt-to-GDP ratio are not going anywhere. If the ceasefire is treated as a return to normalcy, the administration will continue to ignore the underlying structural weaknesses that made the war so costly in the first place. The real tragedy is that this 2-week window will be wasted on domestic political maneuvering rather than on the necessary and undoubtedly painful strategic reevaluation of America's role in the Middle East. If you are a strategist, you do not look at this truce and see peace. You look at this truce and see the cascade of adjustments. The regional powers are using this time to move their assets. The global powers are using this time to secure their supply chains. And the US is using this time to pretend that the old framework still exists. When the 2 weeks expire, the reality will reassert itself, and the friction will be even more difficult to manage than it was before the truce. The system is not healing. It is merely catching its breath before the next structural failure. The celebration within the Iranian political apparatus is not an act of hubris. It is a clinical assessment of their strategic victory. By forcing a ceasefire on their own terms, Tehran has effectively signaled to the regional stakeholders, from the Levant to the Persian Gulf, that the American era of regional management has entered a state of terminal decline. The Iranian leadership understands that victory in a war of attrition is not defined by the destruction of the adversary's capital, but by the adversary's loss of the political and economic will to remain engaged. The brutality of this conflict is found in the mismatch between tactical capability and strategic result. You can destroy the physical infrastructure of a nation in 10 minutes, but you cannot destroy the decentralized, survival-oriented ideology of an adversary that has already factored your destruction into its own design. We must now address the second-order effects on the global energy and financial markets, because this is where the theoretical conflict finally touches the average citizen. When the media describes the stock market surge as a positive reaction to the ceasefire, they are ignoring the fact that this surge is built on a foundation of systemic fragility. The market is cheering for a peace that is, in strategic reality, a tactical pivot. It is ignoring the fact that the regional security architecture is being dismantled in real time. Consider the second-order effect on global maritime security. Every time such a massive aerial bombardment occurs, the regional instability index for the entire Mediterranean and the Levantine basin spikes. This is not just a localized problem for Lebanon or Israel. It is a fundamental disruption of the global maritime supply chain. The insurance underwriters in London, the cold, calculating entities that actually dictate the flow of global trade, do not care about the political justifications for these bombs. They care about the actuarial reality of risk. When the risk profile of a region shifts from unstable to permanently kinetic, the cost of transit becomes a variable that most global shipping firms can no longer absorb. The shock is not the event. The shock is the realization that the global system cannot absorb a single point of failure. If the insurance markets in London withdraw coverage for the region, the ships stop moving, the tankers go dark, and the price of energy enters a phase of volatility that no central bank can stabilize. This is the hidden trap that policymakers in Washington refuse to acknowledge. You do not need to sink a carrier group to paralyze the global economy. You only need to make the risk of transit too high for the private sector to bear. Once the insurance leaves, the world's most critical transit point becomes an empty, silent corridor, and the modern industrial machine grinds to a halt. The strategic community in the West remains fixated on the idea that this is a manageable escalation. They believe that if they apply enough pressure, the rational forces within the Iranian leadership, or its proxies, will eventually sue for peace. This is a profound misunderstanding of the regime's internal evolution. The pragmatic actors who once believed in the possibility of a negotiated settlement have been methodically purged or sidelined. What remains is a hardline coalition that views this conflict not through the lens of economic benefit, but through the lens of historical mission. They have reached a point where the cost of existence is war, and therefore war is the only rational state of being. We are entering a phase where military power is being decoupled from political outcome. The West has overwhelming firepower, but it has no clear political end state that is achievable through that firepower. It has the capacity to destroy, but not the capacity to govern. And in the absence of a governing strategy, destruction is not a tool of policy, it is a tool of chaos. This brings us to the ultimate uncomfortable truth of this era. The global system is no longer organized around the principles of economic efficiency or the open movement of goods. It is organizing itself around the principle of resilience at the expense of integration. As these events continue to unfold, we should expect more, not less, of this systemic friction. The era of a seamless global market is behind us. We are moving toward a world where regional powers consolidate their spheres of influence, and where the cost of doing business will be determined by the proximity to conflict zones. For the average individual, This means that the era of cheap, reliable access to the fruits of global trade is ending. You are paying for the insecurity of the Levant Basin and the Persian Gulf in the price of your commute, the cost of your groceries, and the stability of your local economy. The distance between the conflict in the Middle East and your daily life is not geographic, it is economic, and that distance is shrinking every day. We are not watching the resolution of a conflict. We are watching the systematic dismantling of a global framework that was built on the assumption that it would last forever. It won't. And the final chapter of this history is already being written by those who recognize that the only true path to power in the next decade is not through winning the war, but through successfully surviving the collapse of the system that made the war possible in the first place. The trajectory is set. The only variable remaining is the degree of the friction that the rest of the world will be forced to absorb. And that is not a debate. That is a mathematical certainty. The American leadership, trapped in the survival calculus, will continue to push, creating more instability, more systemic fragility, and eventually, a reality where the global order is just a memory. The Middle East is the epicenter of this collapse, but the shockwaves will reach every corner of the planet. There are no easy choices here, only trade-offs, only consequences. The reality is that the old architecture of stability is being replaced by the new architecture of disruption. Whether this collapse is accidental or orchestrated is a secondary question. The primary question is whether you are positioned to navigate the friction that follows. The transition is not coming, it is here. Adapt, or become part of the wreckage. That is the only law that remains. The ceasefire is not a pause. It is the sound of a world taking a deep breath before the final structural realignment.